Picture this, a bustling bank on a busy afternoon, filled with people standing in line, waiting for their turn. The air is thick with the usual sounds of papers shuffling, quiet conversations, and the clicking of keyboards. In walks a woman, a middle-aged black woman, dressed in simple, understated clothes. She moves confidently, but not in a way that draws attention. Her face is calm, but there's a quiet strength about her. She's here to take care of some personal business, nothing out of the ordinary. As she approaches counter, she's greeted by a bank employee. He's a middle-aged man, stiff in posture, wearing an expression that seems to flicker between irritation and arrogance. You can almost sense he's had a long day, but there's something else. His eyes narrow ever so slightly when he sees her. Without saying much, you can already feel the energy shift. He doesn't greet her warmly. There's no polite smile, no courtesy. Instead, his tone is sharp, dismissive, as if she's not worth his time. The woman doesn't react. She's seen this before. She's lived through moments like this more times than she can count. But still, she remains composed. She hands over her paperwork, quietly explaining what she needs. But the bank employee barely glances at it. He interrupts her before she can finish, his voice louder now, almost as if he's trying to make a point in front of the others in the line. He tells her, "This isn't the right place for you to handle that kind of account." There's a sneer in his words. He's looking at her, but not really seeing her, only the assumptions he's made based on the color of her skin and the simplicity of her clothes. She raises an eyebrow, but says nothing. The employee goes on, talking down to her, explaining how the bank works, as if she doesn't already know. His tone drips with condescension, as though he's teaching a child a lesson. People in the bank start to notice the exchange. Some look uncomfortable, while others just watch, curious to see how this will play out. The woman stands there, still calm, still composed. She lets him finish, not once interrupting his rant. But there's a flicker in her eyes, a quiet resolve, as she reaches into her purse. The man rolls his eyes, clearly irritated by the delay. He doesn't know what's coming. He doesn't know that this woman whom he's been belittling is far from who he thinks she is. What happens next is something no one in that bank, least of all the arrogant employee, will ever forget. The woman, still calm and poised, pulls out a sleek black leather wallet from her bag. The bank employee watches her, his irritation simmering, clearly not expecting much. He taps his fingers on the counter impatiently, glancing over her shoulder to the growing line of customers. In his mind, she's wasting his time. Just another person with a trivial request, another inconvenience in his day. But she takes her time, carefully pulling out a card from the wallet. It's no ordinary bank card. It's a heavy metal one, the kind that only a select few possess. The kind that commands attention in the financial world. She holds it up for him to see, the light catching its metallic sheen. The employee pauses for a moment, the corners of his eyes narrowing. He takes the card from her hand, his expression turning from impatience to confusion. He flips it over, scanning name on the front, then glances up at her, blinking as if trying to piece together what he's seeing. Her name. It's not just any name. He suddenly recognizes it, but he doesn't want to believe what's in front of him. He flips the card again, this time paying closer attention to the details. This isn't just any account. His eyes widen slightly, and for the first time since their interaction began, there's a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. But instead of humbling himself or correcting his earlier behavior, the employee doubles down. Perhaps out of embarrassment, or maybe because he's not used to being wrong. He stiffens, straightening his back, and his tone remains curt. "I'll need to verify this," he mutters under his breath, as if still holding on to his arrogance, unwilling to give her satisfaction of a proper acknowledgement. The woman watches him without a word. She's seen this kind of resistance before. It's a defensive mechanism, a way to hold on to power when it's slipping through your fingers. She knows how this game works. But she says nothing, her calm exterior betraying none of the frustration or anger she might be feeling inside. The employee disappears into a back office, leaving her standing at the counter. She doesn't mind the wait. The other customers are glancing her way now, some whispering to each other, curious about what's going on. From the outside, it may look like an ordinary situation, a customer waiting for a transaction to be processed. But something in the air has changed. There's a tension that wasn't there before. Something feels off, and the customers can sense it. In the back room, the employee is making a call, his voice low but hurried. He's talking to someone from corporate, someone higher up. His arrogance is still there, but now it's mixed with a sense of urgency. He rattles off the woman's name, the account number on the card, but there's a tremor in his voice, like he's beginning to realize he's made a mistake, a big one. He paces back and forth, waiting for a response. When it comes, his face goes pale. The voice on the other end of the line is clear. There's no mistake. This woman is not just rich, she's one of their most important clients. A high net worth individual who could easily have a room full of people at her beck and call. And not only that, but she has connections, powerful ones, the kind of connections that can make or break careers. The employee's heart pounds in his chest. He's messed up, big time. Back at the counter, the woman stands with her hands folded, looking around the bank. The customers who had been watching her now look away, pretending they weren't staring. She doesn't seem fazed by any of it. Her calm, collected demeanor hasn't wavered, though there's a knowing look in her eyes, like someone who's seen this scenario play out before. The minutes tick by, and then the employee reappears. He looks different now, his face flushed, his confidence shaken. He approaches the counter cautiously, the arrogance in his posture completely gone. He clears his throat before speaking, but when he does, his voice is quiet, almost apologetic. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding," he begins, stumbling over his words. He's trying to recover, trying to smooth things over, but he knows it's too late. The woman listens, but she doesn't say anything yet. She lets him continue his awkward apology, watching as he fumbles with his words, trying to undo the damage he caused. It's not just about the mistake with her account, he knows that. It's about the way he treated her, the assumptions he made, the way he dismissed her from the moment she walked in. He stammers through an offer to help her with anything she needs, but it's clear he's no longer in control of the situation. The power dynamic has shifted, and he knows it. She doesn't need him, and now he needs her. It's written all over his face. But the woman still doesn't respond. She just stands there, her silence speaking louder than any words could. The employee fidgets, unsure of what to do next. He's never been in this position before, never had to face the consequences of his actions in such a direct way. He's used to being the one in control, the one who decides how things go. Finally, she looks him in the eye, and for the first time since she walked into the bank, she speaks. Her voice is calm, steady, but there's a weight to her words. "You assumed you knew who I was when I walked in here," she says softly, her gaze never leaving his. "But you didn't." The employee swallows hard, nodding slightly. He knows he's in the wrong, but there's nothing he can say to fix it. The damage is done. The woman reaches for her card on the counter, taking it back from him. She doesn't raise her voice, doesn't make a scene. She doesn't need to. Her silence, her calmness, carries more power than any outburst ever could. She turns to leave, and as she walks toward the door, the entire bank is watching her now. No one is whispering anymore. There's a different kind of energy in the room, a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and a growing realization that they've just witnessed something much bigger than a simple misunderstanding at a bank. As the door closes behind her, the employee stands frozen behind the counter, staring after her. His mind is racing, replaying the events in his head, trying to understand how it all went so wrong so fast. He knows that this isn't the end. There will be consequences, repercussions that go beyond this moment. But for now, all he can do is stand there, feeling the weight of his mistake, knowing that everything has changed in the blink of an eye. Outside, the woman steps into the bright afternoon sun. She pauses for a moment, taking in a deep breath, before continuing on her way. She doesn't look back, doesn't need to. She knows that the lesson has been learned, even if it took more than it should have. As she walks away from the bank, there's a quiet confidence in her stride. She's been here before, different place, different faces, but the same story. And she'll face it again, no doubt. But for now, she's content knowing that today, at least, one more person has learned not to judge a book by its cover. But the story doesn't end here. What the bank employee doesn't know is that this encounter will have ripple effects far beyond what he could ever imagine. As the woman continued down the street, her calm demeanor gave no hint of the storm she had just weathered. To anyone passing by, she seemed like an ordinary person going about her day, unaware of the small earthquake she had caused back in the bank. But she wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened to her, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Yet, today felt different. Today, she wasn't going to just walk away and let the lesson be quietly absorbed by one misguided employee. Her phone buzzed in her purse, a notification lighting up the screen. She took a quick glance. It was a message from her assistant, reminding her of the meeting she had scheduled later that day with one of the bank's top executives. A meeting about a major deal, a deal that, ironically, could determine the future of that very branch and the careers of several people working there, including the man who had just humiliated her. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Without breaking her stride, she tapped a quick response, confirming she'd be there. As she did, her thoughts began to shift. This wasn't just about correcting the wrong that had been done to her today. It was about something bigger, something systemic. And now she had an opportunity to make a real impact, not just for herself, but for others who had faced similar prejudice and mistreatment. Back at the bank, the employee had returned to his work, his arrogance now replaced by a quiet nervousness. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had seriously messed up. The encounter with the woman kept replaying in his mind, but he couldn't focus on it for long. There was a sudden flurry of activity as his manager came out of the back office, looking flustered. Something was happening, something big. The manager glanced around the room, then called the employee over. "We've just received word from corporate," the manager said, his voice hushed but urgent. "One of our VIP clients is coming in later today for a meeting with the higher-ups. It's a major deal, and everything has to be perfect. Do you understand?" The employee nodded quickly, though his mind was racing. A VIP client? Could it be the woman from earlier? No, it couldn't be. She didn't look like someone important. But as he recalled the card she had handed him, a chill crept up his spine. Could he have misjudged her so badly? He felt the weight of his earlier mistake pressing down on him, but he pushed it aside. There was no way that woman had anything to do with the big client they were talking about. Right? Meanwhile, the woman continued on her way, her steps taking her toward the meeting that would soon change everything. She had spent years building her fortune, working her way up from humble beginnings. Her wealth and success hadn't come easily, and she had faced more than her fair share of obstacles, many of them rooted in the same prejudices that had surfaced today. But she had learned to navigate these challenges with grace, never allowing them to derail her. What the bank employee didn't know, what no one at the branch knew, was that she wasn't just any VIP client. She was the driving force behind a major acquisition that would soon shake up the entire banking industry. Her company was in process of negotiating the purchase of a significant stake in the bank's parent company. And once the deal was finalized, she would hold considerable influence over the bank's operations, including decisions about staffing and management. As she approached the gleaming skyscraper where her meeting would take place, the woman smiled to herself. She wasn't out for revenge. Revenge was never her style. But she did believe in accountability, and today, accountability was exactly what was coming. Not just for the employee who had mistreated her, but for an entire system that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked for so long. Inside the bank, the atmosphere had grown tense. Everyone seemed to be on edge, anticipating the arrival of the VIP client. The employee tried to focus on his work, but he couldn't shake the growing sense of dread in the pit of his stomach. He kept glancing at the door, half expecting the woman to walk back in at any moment. But as the minutes ticked by, she didn't appear, and he began to relax slightly. That is, until his manager approached him again, this time with a strange look on his face. "There's something you need to know," the manager said, his voice low and serious. "The client we've been preparing for. She's already been here." The employee blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" he asked, a sinking feeling beginning to take hold. The manager glanced around, then leaned in closer. "The woman you spoke to earlier, the one with the special card? She's not just any client. She's the client. And from what I've heard, she's got some serious power. Corporate is involved. This deal, it could affect everything." The employee's heart skipped a beat. His mind raced as he tried to process what he was hearing. The woman he had dismissed, belittled, and treated with such disdain. She was the VIP. The realization hit him like a freight train. All the assumptions he had made about her based on her appearance, her race, her quiet demeanor, had been so completely, utterly wrong. Panic set in. He had no idea what this meant for him, but he knew it wasn't good. If she had connections at the highest levels of the bank, if she was involved in some kind of major deal, then his actions could have far-reaching consequences. His job, his career, everything could be on the line. But there was nothing he could do now except wait. Wait and hope that the woman didn't decide to use her power against him. Hours later, in a sleek, glass-walled conference room high above the city, the woman sat across from the bank's top executives. The conversation was polite, professional, and focused on the details of the acquisition. But underneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of tension. The executives knew who she was. They knew how much influence she held. And they knew that, with one word, she could change everything for them. The meeting was nearing its conclusion when one of the executives, a silver-haired man with sharp eyes, cleared his throat and glanced at her. "Before we wrap up," he said carefully, "there's something I'd like to address. I understand that there was an incident earlier today at one of our branches. One of our employees may have made a mistake." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to the woman, who remained calm and composed, as always. She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said quietly. "There was an incident." The executive shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I want to assure you that we take these matters very seriously," he continued. "If there was any inappropriate behavior, we will take immediate action. We value your business, your partnership, and we want to make sure that you feel respected and valued as a client." The woman looked at him for a long moment, her gaze steady. Then she smiled, a small knowing smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I appreciate that," she said, "but this isn't just about me. It's about how your institution treats people. People who might not look the way you expect your high-net-worth clients to look. People who might walk into your branches dressed a little differently, or speak a little differently, or come from different backgrounds. This isn't the first time I've experienced something like this, and I'm sure it won't be the last." The executives exchanged uneasy glances. They knew where this was going, and they didn't like it. But they also knew they had no choice but to listen. The woman leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she said. "I'm asking for fairness, for dignity, for every person who walks through your doors to be treated with the respect they deserve, no matter who they are or what they look like." The silver-haired executive nodded quickly, eager to agree. "Of course," he said. "We'll conduct a full review of our policies and training programs. We'll make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again." But the woman wasn't finished. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving the executives. "Good," she said. "Because if it does happen again, if I hear of anything like this happening to anyone else, I won't hesitate to take action. And I have the means to make sure that action is swift." There was no mistaking the message in her words. The executives knew that she had the power to follow through on her threat. And they knew that if she did, it could be devastating for the bank's reputation and future. The meeting ended soon after, with polite handshakes and strained smiles. But as the woman walked out of the conference room, she knew that the real work was just beginning. She had planted the seed of change, but now it was up to the bank to follow through. And as for the employee who had humiliated her, well, she hadn't forgotten him. His fate was sealed, though he didn't know it yet. As the woman left the meeting, the weight of the day seemed to lift from her shoulders, but only slightly. She had done what she needed to do, planted the seeds of accountability where it mattered most. The executives had gotten the message loud and clear. But she knew change, real change, wasn't something that happened in a boardroom after a few choice words. It was a process, a shift that required more than just promises and handshakes. Still, she had taken the first step, and now it was up to them. She made her way down to the lobby of the building, the quiet hum of the city beyond the glass doors growing louder with each step. Her phone buzzed again, a message from her assistant, letting her know the next meeting was confirmed. It wasn't a business deal this time, though. It was something far more personal. While the events at the bank had stirred something in her, today wasn't just about making a point. There was another reason she had stayed so calm, another reason she hadn't lost her composure, even when faced with such blatant disrespect. She had something bigger on her mind, something far more important than her wealth or status. She left the building and climbed into the back of a sleek black car, waiting for her at the curb. The driver gave her a polite nod, and without a word, the car pulled into traffic, heading toward the other side of town. She watched the city pass by in a blur, her thoughts drifting back to the man at the bank. There was no doubt in her mind that he was going to face consequences. Not because she had demanded it, but because that's how the world worked for people in his position, people who thought they could treat others as less than because of the way they looked. But despite everything that had happened, there was a part of her that didn't want to see him lose his job. She didn't want to destroy him. She wanted him to learn, to understand why what he had done was so wrong. But life didn't always offer such neat resolutions. The car finally pulled up outside a modest brownstone in a quiet neighborhood. It was a far cry from the sleek skyscrapers and high-rise offices she frequented for business. Here, the streets were lined with trees, and the pace of life felt slower, more grounded. She stepped out of the car and looked up at the house, her heart heavy with the weight of what was to come. This wasn't just any meeting. This was family. Inside that brownstone lived her mother, a woman who had worked her entire life to provide for her children. Despite the odds stacked against her, her mother was the reason she had become the person she was today, the source of her strength, her resilience. And now, as her mother's health began to fail, this house had become a sanctuary, a place where time seemed to slow down as they prepared for the inevitable. She hadn't told her mother about what had happened at the bank. There was no need to burden her with that story. Her mother had faced far worse in her lifetime. Instead, the woman climbed the steps and knocked softly on the door. It was opened by a nurse, who smiled and stepped aside to let her in. Inside, the house was warm and filled with the soft scent of lavender. Her mother sat in a large armchair by the window, a blanket draped over her legs. She looked frail, but her eyes were as sharp as ever, a spark of recognition lighting up her face when she saw her daughter. "Hey, Mama," the woman said softly, leaning down to give her a gentle hug. Her mother's arms wrapped around her, weak but still full of love. "How was your day?" her mother asked, her voice raspy but full of curiosity. She never stopped asking about her daughter's life, even when her own world had begun to shrink. The woman smiled, pulling up a chair next to her. "Busy," she said, not wanting to get into the details. "But it's good to be here with you now." Her mother's hand reached out, grasping hers. "You always make time for me, don't you?" "Of course, Mama. Always." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between them. Her mother didn't have long. They both knew it, though neither said it aloud. But in this moment, the woman found comfort in just being there, in the quiet presence of the woman who had shaped her life. As they talked, the woman's phone buzzed again. She glanced down at it, expecting another business message. But it wasn't. It was from the bank specifically, from the head of the HR department. A notification about the investigation into the incident with the employee. They had reached a decision. She hesitated for a moment, then opened the message. Her eyes scanned the words, and a mix of emotions flooded through her. The bank had decided to terminate the employee, citing his behavior as a violation of their ethics and customer service policies. It was a clean decision, swift and decisive. But instead of feeling satisfied, a sense of unease settled over her. She had expected this outcome, but now that it was here, it didn't feel right. She thought back to the man's face, the look of confusion and fear that had crossed it when he realized who she was. She didn't like the man. In fact, she thought he had been rude, condescending, and everything that was wrong with the way people were treated based on assumptions. But as much as she believed in accountability, she didn't want this man to lose his livelihood, especially if he didn't truly understand why what he had done was wrong. She slipped her phone back into her bag and looked at her mother, who was watching her with wise, knowing eyes. "You're thinking about something," her mother said softly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I know that look." The woman sighed. "I just got word that the bank fired the employee who was rude to me earlier. He deserved it, I suppose. But it doesn't feel right." Her mother finished for her. The woman nodded, surprised at how well her mother could still read her. "I didn't want to destroy him. I just wanted him to learn." Her mother squeezed her hand gently. "Sometimes we think the only way people will learn is through punishment. But that's not always the case. Some people need a different kind of lesson. And if you don't feel right about it, maybe there's more you can do." The woman sat quietly for a moment, considering her mother's words. Maybe there was more she could do. Maybe, instead of just letting the bank handle things their way, she could reach out to the employee herself. After all, she had the power to influence the situation. She didn't want to humiliate him further. She wanted to give him a chance to understand. The next day, back in her office, the woman made a decision. She contacted the bank and requested a meeting with the employee. It was an unusual request, but given her influence, the bank agreed. The employee, still reeling from the news of his termination, was shocked when he received the call. He had expected to walk away from the bank in disgrace, not to be summoned to meet with the very woman who had the power to end his career. The meeting was arranged in a quiet conference room at the bank. The woman sat at the head of the table, her posture calm and composed, as the employee entered, his head hanging low, eyes downcast. He looked defeated, his arrogance completely gone, replaced by fear and shame. He sat down across from her, avoiding her gaze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then finally, the woman broke the silence. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. The employee nodded slightly. "I assume it's about my termination," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman tilted her head, studying him for a moment. "Yes, it is," she said. "But it's also about more than that. I wanted to speak with you personally, because I don't think you fully understand why what happened was wrong." The employee looked up at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "I know I messed up," he said quickly. "I didn't treat you with the respect you deserved. I'm sorry." The woman held up a hand, stopping him. "It's not just about me," she said. "It's about how you see people, how you judge them based on their appearance. You assumed that because I didn't look like someone with money, I wasn't important. And that's where the problem lies." The employee shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he didn't interrupt. "You didn't take the time to see me as a person," she continued. "You saw what you wanted to see. But what you didn't know is that I've worked hard for everything I have. I didn't come from wealth. I didn't grow up with privilege. But I built something for myself, and I expect to be treated with the same respect as anyone else who walks into this bank." The employee's eyes were downcast again, and for the first time, the woman saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Understanding. Shame. Regret. "I know," he said quietly. "I didn't realize it at the time, but now I see what I did. I'm sorry. I really am." The woman nodded slowly, considering his words. She could see that he meant it, that he had learned something from this experience. But she wasn't done yet. "I'm not here to make sure you lose your job," she said, surprising him. "I could have let the bank fire you, and maybe that's what should happen. But I wanted to give you a chance. A chance to really learn from this. If you can do that, if you can change the way you treat people, then maybe this doesn't have to be the end of your career." The employee looked up at her, disbelief and hope mixing in his expression. He had expected to walk away with nothing, but now, he saw a glimmer of a second chance. "I don't want you to lose everything because of one mistake," the woman continued. "But you have to understand that this kind of behavior can't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone. Do you understand?" He nodded, his voice shaking as he responded. "I do. Thank you. Thank you for giving me this chance." The woman stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. She had said what she needed to say, and now it was up to him to take the lesson to heart. As she walked out of the room, she felt a sense of closure. She had given him a chance, not because she owed it to him, but because she believed in the power of second chances. And as she left the bank for the final time, she knew that this chapter of her life was coming to an end. But as she stepped out into the busy street, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time she'd have to fight for fairness, for respect, for dignity. The world was full of people, like that bank employee, people who judged others without knowing their story. And as long as those people existed, her work wasn't done. With a deep breath, she hailed a cab and headed toward her next meeting, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As she rode in the back of the cab, the woman's thoughts lingered on the conversation she'd just had with the bank employee. It wasn't often that she found herself in a position where she could directly influence someone's future like that. But today, she had chosen to extend grace rather than punishment. Whether he learned from it or not was up to him. She hoped he would, that he would take this second chance seriously and change the way he interacted with others. Not just in his job, but in life. The city buzzed around her, the noise and chaos of the world moving forward as if the small pivotal moment in that bank conference room had never happened. But for her, it had. It felt like a chapter closing, not just in her dealings with that particular bank, but in how she viewed her own journey. She had faced disrespect before, and she knew she would face it again. What mattered was how she chose to respond each time, how she held her ground without losing her sense of self. The cab pulled up in front of her apartment building, and she paid the driver before stepping out onto the sidewalk. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the ground, and she took a moment to appreciate the warmth on her skin. Inside, her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't rush to check it. Whatever it was, it could wait. She needed a moment to breathe, to let the day sink in before diving into anything else. As she made her way into the building and rode the elevator to her floor, her mind shifted to her mother. Her mother had been right about so many things about how grace could be a more powerful tool than anger. about how sometimes people just needed a different kind of lesson. She wished she could talk to her mother again now, tell her how everything had played out. But for now, she was content to let the memory of their last conversation settle in her mind. She unlocked the door to her apartment and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar warmth and quiet of home. It was a stark contrast to the chaos of the outside world, and she felt a sense of relief wash over her. After the whirlwind of the day, this was what she needed: a place to decompress, to reflect. She set her bag down on the kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of water, leaning against the counter as she sipped slowly. The events of the day replayed in her mind: her confrontation at the bank, the meeting with the executives, and finally, her decision to meet with the employee. It had all felt like a test of who she was, of the values she held dear. In that moment, she realized something important: her wealth, her status. None of that defined her. What defined her was how she treated others, how she responded to adversity, and how she carried herself in the face of challenges. She had the power to make a difference, not just because of her money, but because of the choices she made. And today, she had chosen to be the bigger person, to extend compassion in a world that so often lacked it. As the evening wore on, she allowed herself to relax. She turned on some music, made herself a simple dinner, and curled up on the couch with a book. For the first time in what felt like days, she wasn't thinking about the bank or the employee or the meetings. She was just in the moment, enjoying the peace of her own space. But just as she was settling in, her phone buzzed again. This time, she checked it. It was a message from her assistant, letting her know that a major client had requested a meeting for the following morning. Business never slowed down, it seemed. She smiled to herself, knowing that this was just the way her life worked. There would always be more meetings, more clients, more deals to close. But after today, she felt more grounded in her approach to it all. She knew who she was, and she knew what she stood for. The next morning, she woke up early, ready to dive back into work. The events of the previous day were still fresh in her mind, but they no longer felt as heavy. She had dealt with the situation as best she could, and now it was time to move forward. The bank incident was behind her, but the lessons she had taken from it remained. As she arrived at her office, her assistant greeted her with a stack of papers and a list of meetings for the day. It was business as usual, but she felt different, more focused, more at peace with herself. She spent the morning in meetings, negotiating deals, and making decisions. It was the same routine she had followed for years, but there was a renewed sense of purpose in her actions. By lunchtime, she found herself reflecting on what her mother had said about second chances. She had given the bank employee a chance to learn and grow, but in doing so, she had also given herself a chance to reflect on her own path. She realized that, just like the bank employee, she was still learning too. Every experience, every challenge, was an opportunity for growth. In the days that followed, life continued on its usual course. But the ripple effect of what had happened at the bank became evident in subtle ways. The woman noticed small changes in herself, in the way she approached her work, in the way she treated the people around her. She found herself more patient, more understanding, and more willing to listen. She had always been driven, always focused on success, but now she was more aware of the human element in everything she did. One afternoon, about a week after the meeting with the employee, she received an unexpected email. It was from the bank, but not from the executive she had met with. It was from the employee himself. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, unsure of what to expect. The email was short, but heartfelt. He thanked her for giving him a second chance, for not allowing him to be defined by his worst moment. He wrote about how the experience had opened his eyes to the ways he had been treating people, and how he was committed to doing better, not just at work, but in his life. It was an apology, yes, but more than that, it was a reflection of growth. He had taken the lesson to heart. She smiled as she read it, feeling a sense of closure that she hadn't realized she needed. In a way, the email was the final chapter of this particular story. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic resolution, but it was enough. It was a reminder that change, while slow and sometimes difficult, was always possible. She replied with a simple message: "Thank you for taking the time to reflect. I wish you the best moving forward." With that, she closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, a sense of peace washing over her. The world was far from perfect, and there were still countless battles to fight. But for now, she felt content in knowing that she had made a difference, even in a small way. As the weeks turned into months, the memory of the bank incident faded, but its impact lingered in the woman's life. She continued to approach her work with the same drive and determination, but there was a new layer of empathy in everything she did. She had always been a strong advocate for fairness and respect, but now she understood the importance of grace and second chances in a deeper way. Her business continued to thrive, and she remained a respected figure in her industry. But beyond the success and accolades, she was proud of the person she had become, the person who could face adversity with strength, but also with compassion. In the end, it wasn't about being rich or powerful. It was about being human, about recognizing the humanity in others and in herself. And as she looked to the future, she knew that no matter what obstacles lay ahead, she would face them with the same grace and resilience that had brought her this far.